Hi guys, so we're going to be looking at comparative theories today, looking at the realist theory and the liberal theory and comparing them with each other. So first off, I want us to start off thinking about global politics in general and why are these theories born about global politics? Where do they stem from? And it's actually thinking about firstly about society in general before applying that to the wider world. So we think about society in general and the reason why we have laws, the reason why we have structure and all those sorts of things. In the liberal consensus, which is essentially the world we live in today, the theory of Thomas Hobbes is taken to be quite a strong, solid foundation. And in it he talks about, in his book Leviathan, written during the English Civil War, he talks about the idea of the natural state of man or the state of nature. And in it he describes a really bleak situation where there is constant war, there is constant death and constant fear. So just to mention that to him, he believed that the life of man would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish and short. And that is because even the weakest man has strength to kill the strongest because he can hire someone to kill someone on his behalf. People will constantly kill and constantly steal. And you'll be in a state of continual war of every man against every man because you essentially have to attack before you are attacked. So attack is the best form of defense. So there's no peace, there's no stability. And as he argues, in such a condition, there is no place for industry because the fruit thereof is uncertain. Because you might produce something, and when you've worked hard to produce something and poured all of your labour into that, the person who agreed to buy it might end up not buying it or might end up stealing from you. So there's no point in investing in things like industry because there is no guarantee that the industry will bear fruit. There's also no society and, which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. So it's a really bleak environment, the state of nature, where the life of man is short, where there is nothing really to gain from being alive except for just trying to survive. So it's a state of complete equality where anybody can kill you at any moment. There is no security. So the remedy to this state of nature was put forward by both Hobbes and Locke in their theory of the social contract, by Rousseau as well. But in terms of our liberal democracies, the social contract, which has been kind of heavily adopted, is Locke's interpretation of the social contract, Locke's interpretation of the ideal government, which is created and constructed in order to keep the state of nature at bay. So the social contract then is, obviously it's a thought experiment, it's not something tangible, but it's the theory that we give up some freedom so that we can get security in return. So we were born completely equal, but instead we've agreed to give up our autonomy in certain areas in order to protect ourselves. So essentially what we do is we appoint a night watchman. So night watchman is just kind of like a police officer, and the state essentially acts as a police officer to make sure that there is no injury onto other people, and they are set up to establish and protect life, liberty and property. So a very minimal government, and essentially this government is chosen by the people and they are there to protect us. But the question is though, where does the night watchman's legitimacy come from? And it is, in essence, in a liberal democracy, it comes from the people because people vote and elect their leaders. And thus, every 5 years, they have the right in the UK to remove those leaders if they are not satisfied with them. So our government has legitimacy because it is chosen from the people in a democratic sense. So we were thinking about this then. Let's talk about the state of nature and let's talk about it in terms of the United Kingdom. So let's imagine before we had government in the UK, it was essentially a state of nature where there was a continual fear, continual fighting and constant war, according to Hobbes. So in order to prevent that, the people in Britain came together and appointed a night watchman. This is theoretical and obviously historically inaccurate, but essentially basically gave up their sovereignty, gave up their power and gave it to a higher body in order to protect them. So that's how it works in the UK. However, Britain does not exist on its own. So maybe in Britain they've made this agreement, but what about the rest of the world? So let's say the United States have made that agreement and they have their night watchman state. Russia has, China has, Brazil, Bolivia, and so forth, right? The people in charge of those states, however, are still in a state of nature. Because it's easy for Mexico to choose a leader, and that leader will represent the Mexican people and improve life for people in Mexico. However, how can we come to an international consensus for an international government when we are all so different? So if you think about the United Kingdom, it is a nation state in the sense that it is comprised of people, of a nation, same history, same culture, same language on the whole, and they have their state, so they have the government represents the people inside the nation, and then that kind of means that they can pass laws which are fit for purpose for those people. But a person from the United Kingdom is very different to a person from Angola. So would it even be possible to have a single government who could actually manage to represent all of the people in the world? So a night watchman state is actually not really feasible on an international scale because it's just too diverse and too mixed. It's too big, essentially. So if the night watchman keeps a state of nature at bay for states, what does this do for states internationally? And we're going to look at the two different theories which try to explain that and try to answer how do states interact with each other on a global scale. So essentially, what we do with global theories then is we have ideologies, and what an ideology is it's looking at how individuals behave in a state and how our behaviour should be mitigated by government. So ideologies, they have their theory of human nature, they have their theory of the status quo, and then they look to change it based on their theory of human nature, right? So for example, the conservative ideology feels that humans are innately bad, we're quite stupid, we're not very rational, so therefore there should be a higher aristocracy who mitigates against that to try and create laws to keep, the criminal classes at bay and that sort of thing, right? So that's talking about it on a state level in terms of ideologies. Global theories is similar in the sense that it's theoretical. It's trying to make opinions and judgments about how people behave. But instead of looking at on the individual level, like with ideologies, it's looking at more so in a global context and thinking, how do states behave in a global context? So in terms of the two main political theories, I've already said it, but what are they? They are the realist theory, and I've represented here with risk, okay? And the reason why I've chosen risk is that is essentially the realist interpretation of the world order. It's constantly about attacking before you're attacked. It's about trying to expand to secure power and secure influence as well. And then the other theory is liberalism, which is much more optimistic, saying that it's in our interest to work well together as states, and therefore we should work well together. So realist theory, then, the dominant theory is this idea of the state being central to everything. So it's a state-centric view. So everything in international relations is about the state and the state fulfilling its interests. There is international anarchy, so there is no one figure in charge. There is no one body in charge. It is just literally a collection of states who share the same world, and therefore they're looking to protect themselves as much as possible. So the international system is not one of cooperation, it's one of self-help. It's one of individualism for states. So they say that there is a rational competition for power and security, and it's rational in the sense that if you're not looking to secure your power and secure your security, you're actually looking to potentially leave your state as being quite vulnerable. So liberalism challenges this view, and it talks about, instead of being this perpetual cycle of war and chaos and anarchy, it's actually more so about compromise, cooperation and peace. So states are becoming increasingly interconnected with a series of complex interdependence, which means, we rely on each other economically, there's a lot of international trade, we are more politically integrated and especially quite culturally integrated as well. So we won't want to go to war with countries which we see ourselves in so clearly as well. It talks about harmony and balance, the idea of democratic peace theory. So because more of the countries around the world are democratic, we have more in common with these countries, and because we have more in common with these countries, we're less likely to go to war with them. And also the idea of global governance, so talking about things like the UN, institutions and bodies like that, and about coming together to have not quite the same power as a state, but an authority who can enforce and guarantee international law. So we'll start off looking at realism first, and realism can be summarised quite well with something called the billboard model. So essentially the billboard model is, so if you look at a game of billiards or pool, you can see you've got the states are represented in each of these balls. So all of the balls have their own hard surface, and essentially they all bounce off each other, and the hard surface represents like the defense systems of each state. So the hard shell of the billboard is about the protection that the state has, so their army and so forth. And rather than it being, look, we're all going to come together and stay together, we will bounce off each other, states will bounce off each other, they will repel each other in order to preserve their own self-interest. So nation states are equally sovereign, so they each are their own independent ball, although obviously we have different powers in different states and so forth. So essentially to realists, the state sovereignty is central to global relations, so it's all about maintaining the sovereignty of the state. So the state is the key actor then, and this has been seen constantly in international relations. So the Treaty of Westphalia, about states coming together to preserve the balance of power and the recognition of the power of the nation state. It's also the cornerstone of international relations. So whenever there is a discussion about things in international politics, it's about preserving the nation state. It's also the building block for international organisations as well. So the UN looks to guaranteeing the sovereignty of all members, which is about protecting the sovereignty of the nation state. So beginning with the Treaty of Westphalia, but set down in the UN Charter as well, about guaranteeing nobody has the right to interfere in the issues of the nation state. The state is sovereign in its own affairs, and nobody has the right to step in and intervene in that. So for realism then, its views can be rooted in its view of human nature. So realists argue that because states are governed by humans, they are governed actually by human nature. So the human nature is the state's nature. So the way that humans behave around the state, outside the state, is how a state will behave, because it's humans who are in charge of the state. So as Thomas Hobbes argued, one of the earliest realists, he says that humans are driven by a perpetual and restless desire of power after power that cease only in death. So essentially, states represent what human nature is, and that is that there is a continual thirst for power, and this thirst for power can never be quenched. People will continuously go to try and gain and attain more power because it's for their ego essentially, and because we're irrational and we're self-interested, we're constantly looking to gain more power. And obviously if states are gaining power, the only way that you can gain that is from impeding on another state's power. So the more powerful one state gets, the more vulnerable other states feel, and this leads to a constant cycle of war, of suspicion, and thus no international society, just anarchy instead. He also talks about, when he talks about it in Leviathan, he talks about how we give our power in a social contract to a Leviathan, a strong monarch, a strong person who represents us. And we've entered this social contract with this person. He reminds us when he's writing in Leviathan that this person is actually doing a great sacrifice for us, and that is because they are still in a state of nature themselves. So because they are still in a state of nature, they need to have the army, so we need to be paying taxes and giving them those taxes in order to maintain their army and to maintain the country's defence. So sovereigns or states are still in a state of nature themselves against other sovereigns or other states. So states then are the key actors in international politics, and states are governed by human nature. So states govern in national interests motivated by self-interest. So Kenneth Waltz, one of the key realists, he talks about states being security maximizers. So essentially the self-interest of states, and thus the national interest, is about guaranteeing as much security as possible. So it could be by building a missile defense system or something, but constantly looking at ways to protect the country as much as possible. And that's the aim of the state, according to Waltz, about maintaining and maximizing security as much as possible. Another realist contrasts this and looks at it in a bit of a different view, so Mersheimer, and he essentially says we're not security maximizers, we're actually power maximizers. So states are predatory. They look to attack because if you attack, you can defend, right? Because if you've got a hostile neighbour, if you actually just go and in the middle of the night slit their throats while they're sleeping, then you've guaranteed your security. You've also increased your power. So the more power you have, the more security you have. And that's because if you're a powerful nation like the United States, other countries won't invade or attack you because they feel like they're going to lose and it's not worth the risk. So by having more power, you gain more influence. By having more influence, you have more security. And he says this interesting quote, "In an anarchic world of international politics, it is better to be Godzilla than Bambi." And that's because Bambi represents obviously the Disney film, which is the weak little deer, and obviously he can't really defend himself. He has to run away after his mother gets killed, which is obviously a really horrible and traumatic scene, whereas Godzilla can mess anything up. So it's better to continually build yourself up to have this strength and use it occasionally to show that you're willing to exercise it. So as a few other realist thinkers said, so Morgenthau, he argues that international politics, like all politics, is a struggle for power. So it's a struggle to gain as much power as possible because that's how we defend ourselves. So as Clausewitz says, war is merely a continuation of politics by other means. So if international relations is politics, that is actually politics not through dialogue and discussion but through war, because that's how you prove yourself, that's how you prove your strength, and that's how you get things done. You win the war. Because you've won the war, you're able to exercise power. So is war in the state's interest? So this is an interesting question because the answer is yes and no. If you have a strong state, it can be in your interest because you're more likely to win that war. If you win that war, you get more land, you get more wealth, and you get more security by that. However, it's not necessarily, even for strong states, in their interest to go to war. And even though Morgenthau is a realist, he actually did oppose the Vietnam War. And he opposed it because war doesn't always work best for states. Even if you're a strong country, it doesn't work best for states. And that's because it can create more instability. So it can create more instability and vulnerability through losing the war, potentially, even if it's a low risk, through the cost of war, not just financial, but human lives as well. And as we saw with the Vietnam War, which is at the time when he was writing, you saw that there was the internal struggle within America. It was actually the massive decline of the presidency because it exposed the credibility gap. It showed the American people that their politicians can lie to them and that they often will for self-gain. And it showed the ego of people like Kennedy and Johnson who went to this war just to kind of stop the USSR from spreading in their interpretation. So it's not necessarily a good thing. The other thing as well is war does create power vacuums too. So there's the fallout of war as well, and about how that can influence further international conflicts. So for example, during the Cold War, the Americans invaded Afghanistan in the 1970s, and they ended up, so Afghanistan had a legitimate communist revolution. So the Americans gave weapons to the Taliban in Afghanistan, who were the anti-communists at the time. Even though they were quite a suspect group, they gave them ammunition and weapons because rather have these fundamentalists in power than have the communists in power. And as a result, obviously, the Taliban became much more powerful. And then eventually, as we can see in more recent decades, they end up becoming enemies of the West. And they have the equipment and the leadership in the Middle East in order to actually achieve that as well. So the power vacuum is also problematic too, and it leads to problems later on in society, in the world stage. So in terms of this then, you've got international anarchy, one of the realist principles. And for international anarchy, they argue that this is the state of world politics. There is international anarchy. And that's because there's no supranational authority to enforce international law. States are self-reliant. So this is actually perfectly seen, this idea of self-interest, no authority to enforce international law in the coronavirus crisis of 2020. So you can see in March 2020, there was a shipment of masks coming from China to Europe, so going to Germany and Italy. And this was personal protective equipment, so things like masks and gloves. They were going to Germany, they were going to Italy, because these countries are in dire crisis. They don't have enough equipment to protect their frontline staff. So they ordered this shipment in, and as the shipment was arriving in Europe, Trump intercepted it and said that these are going to America. He outbid Germany and Italy, and said, look, even though they were coming to you, I've actually given them a counter offer, and now this equipment is coming to America. So this is considered to be international piracy. It's considered to be illegal in terms of international law. However, who is there to enforce this international law, especially with America, being that America has such a strong stake in the UN? So it's about self-reliance, it's about self-interest, protecting your people above all people, and there's nobody realistically to stop you doing that. There's also their idea that war is inevitable. So as we saw a minute ago with Clausewitz, he said that war is war is continuation of politics by other means. And he essentially says, what he's saying there is that because states are seeking security, they're seeking power and influence, this can only be achieved from taking from other states. Because you know this, you know that the state near you might be looking to attack you because they want to secure their power. So you're going to attack them before they can attack you. So it's just something which is always going to happen. So Morgenthau said, it's essentially the struggle for power is universal in time and space. It is just the common language. We all know what this is. It's human nature. It's the way that we are. Therefore, it is the way that states are. And because nation states are the highest authority and nation states look to preserve their self-interest, that self-interest is their defence and their security, which can be guaranteed through war, through expansion. There's also this idea of the security dilemma. So this is that if one state increases power, it's a threat to another state. So realists are obsessed with something called the balance of power and looking to constantly maintain that balance of power. And you want that balance of power to be in favour of your country as well. So if you have a slight advantage to another state and you see that they're starting to rear their heads a bit, then you're going to want to smack them down before they're able to smack you harder. We saw this with the First World War. There was the balance of power in Europe, guaranteed after the Napoleonic Wars, and you essentially had Germany began to become more powerful than Britain. Their industrial output had actually surpassed Britain by the beginning of the 20th century. They also, in the early 1900s, they had their first metropolis. So metropolis is a city of over 1 million. And Berlin's population was actually bigger than London's population for the first time. And then that was quite problematic because it means that Berlin and Germany were surpassing Britain. And if they're surpassing Britain, then they'll be able to defeat Britain in war, especially as they had the dreadnought, the ship, and they were building ships and they were building them at quicker paces. So they were building them quicker than Britain was. So people began to think that this is the security dilemma, that Germany is becoming the most powerful country in Europe. If it becomes the most powerful country in Europe, that's a threat to security. So we need to go to war with them before they become too strong to a point in which we won't be able to defeat them. So that's the realist view. It's a very negative, or as they would say, realistic view of international politics, and one where there's a perpetual cycle of war, of distrust, and a constant system of anarchy. Liberals are a lot more optimistic, and that's because, as Locke argued, humans are guided by rationalism. We are rational creatures. We know what's best for us. We know that sometimes we're going to have to put our self-interest aside and prioritize other people and cooperation, because ultimately it will be better for us anyway. So to people like Locke then, it's about solving disputes by discussion and negotiation, because ultimately going to war is dangerous. You might lose war. It's not rational to go to war. War can still happen, but only as a last resort. So for two things, either for defense, so if you are attacked, you can defend yourself, and also to end oppression, so protection of human rights around the world. So this is supported by Kant, who talks about the moral element of human nature. So in terms of our human nature, we're rational, we're self-interested, but our rationality means that we can steer that self-interest towards cooperation. You have Kant, who argues that morality is what guides us. It's about treating human beings as ends, not means. We should never use and abuse people to get what we want, but treat people as human beings, treat them well. So he talks about universal and perpetual peace. So he talks about creating a federation of free states bound together by conditions of universal hospitality. So he has this idea then of the fact that you have democratic peace theory, as it's called in modern days, which is this idea that the more countries which are democratic, the more countries which support the same values and views of what he calls universal hospitality, the more peace there will be around the world. They will create a harmony and a balance as a result. And that's because when countries are democracies, they are governed by the rule of law. If they're governed by the rule of law, then they're looking to protect human rights and protect human beings, which works with the views of perpetual peace. So all states protect the rights of their citizens. States will then work together to achieve a collective good, and the rights of citizens everywhere are universally respected. And if a country respects their citizens' rights, then the countries will protect the rights of other people, because they will also view them as human beings who deserve mutual respect. So you have then the connection of democracy, which means that everybody has the same values. Then because you have the same values, you want to trade with other countries with the same values. So you're economically connected. Therefore, you don't want to go to war with somebody who's buttering your bread, essentially. And you've also got international organisations to help facilitate this trade and this cooperation. Therefore, you have peace. So it's about the rule of law over egotistical pursuit of self-gain. So then this idea of the democratic peace theory, then you have international law emerging in order to guarantee the harmony and balance. Although, as we've seen already, it's quite, tested whether or not people actually realistically have to follow international law. So states are working towards the same ends of peace and prosperity. So this is obviously best represented in the United Nations, which is talking about peace and security, sustainable development, human rights, and humanitarian assistance. So a collection of nations who come together to try and solve global problems rather than working in isolation. And they don't go to war with each other. And democratic states don't go to war with each other because they are culturally similar. They have the same set of values, and those values are ones which do not like war. So in terms of global governance and complex interdependence, so complex interdependence is a theory that sees the growing interconnectedness between states. So the decision of one state affects another state because we are all connected. And this was advocated by Joseph Nye. And essentially what we have then is globalization. So the rise of globalization, which is a theory of liberals. It's not necessarily a true thing, globalization, and it's tested and it's contested with different thinkers. But essentially to liberals, globalization is a thing. And with them, it's about states no longer being dominant actors anymore. They're all connected with each other. and the rise of non-state actors, so NGOs, IGOs, and intergovernmental organisations. So it's a bit of a satire, this cartoon here, but I claim this land in the name of His Majesty. And it's reflecting the idea that in the Middle Ages, and even up until the 20th century, it was essentially about, for your government, for your country, colonising other countries in order to make your country richer. However, now with intergovernmental organisations, you have something like the IMF, which is, instead of saying I claim this land, it's I structurally adjust this land in the name of economic growth. So we can see, for example, the way that the IMF has treated Ethiopia and said that Ethiopia, if you want to have these bailouts, you can only have money to support your economy if you advocate and implement these neoliberal reforms. So it's essentially about forcing countries to become more neoliberal in that sense. So whether or not that's a good thing is obviously down to opinion. But essentially, there is greater globalization, there's greater connections between states, which isn't just between the nation state anymore. You also have communication through supranational bodies as well. So things like the UN, things like the World Bank. You've also got the G7 or G8. You've also got things like Interpol, so collecting an international police organisation, sharing intelligence and resources between different countries to try and catch international criminals. You've got the European Union, obviously, and you've just got an increased amount of international bodies like the World Bank, the WTO, and so forth. You've also got then, with the liberal interpretation, military power and state security do not dominate international agenda. So when it comes to UN meetings, the things that are talked about most are things like human rights, poverty, and the environment, which is about protecting human security, human rights. You've also got military is no longer the main go-to for having influence around the world, so it doesn't play a major role anymore. And that's because there has been a massive decline in hard power. You're seen as quite illegitimate as a state if you start exercising hard power, and it's seen as quite a negative thing. You've also got the decline in the security dilemma. So states can increase their power, and because we live in a global world which is reaffirmed through international bodies, it means that you don't have to fear another country becoming more powerful, because you've got your NATO bloc who will defend you if anything happens, for example. Just like we saw that when the Crimea was annexed by the Russians, the world reacted and they were kicked out of the G8. Although, what's that done for the Crimea? But anyway, so making money then is more important than war, and war is a disruptor to making money. Therefore, war is less likely to happen, and we're living in an era of greater peace. You also, I forgot to mention as well, in terms of NGOs, we've got greater influence of NGOs. So pressure groups like Greenpeace are quite effective in not just lobbying governments inside their own countries, but lobbying transnational organisations as well. You also have as well the rise of companies too. So Google has had negotiations with the People's Republic of China over about freedom of speech, freedom of what to include in the Google searches and so forth. So yeah, it's about not just states being the main actors in the international system, but corporations, NGOs and IGOs as well. So what I want you to do then is thinking about the differences between liberals and realists. I've created the sheet for you, and you've got in the middle, you've got criteria, so human nature, global governance, inevitability of war, and security dilemma. And what I want you to do is just maybe summarise in the middle here what each of those things are, and then put the liberal view, and then put the realist view underneath the appropriate column as well. So just looking and trying to work out what the differences are between these two theories. So if you have if you do it on Good Notes, it would be page 9 of the student guide. If you go for a student guide, you go to the first chapter, you can see there's a whole section which talks about the divisions. So if you read that, think about what we've talked about as well as what you've learnt before, just put down some notes onto that sheet for yourselves. Okay, So the last thing that we're going to look at then is trying to reconcile these differences a little bit. And this is put forward in the Anarchical Society. And in it, instead of saying about, an anarchical society or global governance, what Hedley Bull does is he actually says that we don't live in global governance, right? That's just a bit too optimistic. There is no world policeman, there is no international law. That's not true. Neither do we live in an anarchy, though, because there are relations between states. So instead, we live in a society of states. So kind of like the liberal idea that we're a collection of individuals, right? Or neoliberalism and Thatcherism, that there's no such thing as society necessarily. We're just little atoms kind of bouncing off each other. So what Hedley Bull was saying was that yes, there is relationships between states. We're in a society of states. We're a collection of states. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because we work together. And we work together because over time, different nations have built different connections and trusts with each other. So those are mostly based on trade. So it's about trying to preserve mutually beneficial relationships. So people won't really want to infringe on those relationships. But states are still the main decision makers. States are still really important in an international context as well. Okay, so we're going to do next, we're actually going to do question 3, but I'll send a separate recording which will talk about that. Okay, any questions, please let me know.